Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Speed Up Detection of Advanced Attacks, brought to you by ThreatTrack and Dark Reading and broadcast by United Business Media Limited. I'm Tim Wilson, Editor-in-Chief of Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. Next slide, please. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during this webinar. Just type your question into the Q&A text area located to the right of the presentation window, and then click the Submit button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides by clicking on the Additional Resources button located below the presentation window. If you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the help link below the presentation window. In addition, you can contact our technical support helpline, which is also located in the webinar help guide. Next slide, please. Now on to the presentation, How to Speed Up Detection of Advanced Attacks. I'm excited about our conversation today because at Dark Reading, we're doing a lot of coverage of breaches and compromises. And one of the things that we hear very frequently is that there's a very long gap between the time that a compromise occurs and the time that it's detected, and an even longer gap between the time that a compromise occurs and the time it's actually remediated. And we have seen in various reports ranging from Verizon's data breach investigations report to other industry reports that the gap there can be as long as days, weeks, or even years in some cases between the time that a compromise occurs and the time that something is actually done about it. And we also hear frequently that the reports of a compromise often come from a third party. They're never detected by the victim company. So one of the things that we hope to help you with today is to give you a sense for ways that you can shorten that time between the compromise and the time that you actually recognize it as an attack and the time that you can do something about it. So with that, today we have two great speakers. Tom Parker is the CTO of the security consultancy FusionX. Tom is recognized throughout the security industry for his research in multiple areas, including adversary profiling and software vulnerability research and analysis. He's published books on the topic of information security, including cyber adversary characterization, auditing the hacker mind, and is a contributor to the popular Stealing the Network series. Tom is a frequent speaker at conferences, including Black Hat, and often lends his time to guest lecturing at universities and participating in community research initiatives. He's frequently called on to provide his expert opinion of mass media organizations, including Dark Reading and Information Week, as well as BBC News, CNN, and lots of other publications. Hey, Tom, how are you?
Hey, great. Thanks for inviting me on.
Well, it's good to have you here. Our other speaker who will speak after Tom is Eric Hay. He's a senior systems engineer at ThreatTrack Security, which is a firm focused on malware detection, analysis, and remediation. He has over 20 years of experience focused primarily on computer security, including encryption, systems management, and more recently, malware analysis. He speaks often on cyber issues and has presented at the CSI conference, the NLIT Summit, and numerous events for the Department of Defense and civilian agencies. Hi, Eric. How are you?
Doing great, thanks.
Well, Tom, I'm going to let you get started. Really interested to hear your take on how to shorten this gap that we've been talking about. So take it away.
Absolutely. Sounds like a plan. So just to kind of reiterate the subject of today's discussion, because it is, I think there is obviously some nuances between the point at which a breach takes place, the point at which it's detected, and then the point at which there's a human response to that compromise. And so we're going to be talking about each of those phases with the ultimate goal of helping organizations get to that human response earlier on. And then the majority of data breaches that you hear about today, they are so impactful on the organization because it takes so long, not necessarily to get from breach to detection, but to get to that final point where there's actually a human response to the adversary's actions. Tim already gave a great introduction, thanks Tim, but I just want to give a little more background on why perhaps our organization, FusionX, is qualified to speak on this. Unlike most security assessment firms, we're 100% focused on simulating real-world adversaries. And a lot of what we do is simulate the attacks in a way that allows us to measure how long it takes organizations to detect and respond to our activities. And everything is very scenario-driven, so we're not just doing an assessment. We're actually simulating the theft of source code or the breach of PII through a third-party HVAC vendor or whatever the scenario might be. And so that allows us to measure exactly how long it takes these organizations and then help them with that, improving that response time. And what we see typically doesn't look great. We see that it, while an event may have been detected, it's buried deep down in a log file somewhere that no one has any hope of ever seeing. And so a lot of what we try and do is improve the human process. There's a lot of investment today in shiny objects and technologies, but what's missing a lot of the time is that human process around those technologies. And so that's what we're going to focus on really today. So as many of you are aware, we've seen many compromises so far in 2012, and I say so far, we're of course almost at the end of the year already. Some of those cases, there was no detection at all. In other words, there just weren't detective technologies, IDSs, firewall logs, and so forth that showed any compelling evidence of a breach. We've seen cases where detection systems were subverted, and we definitely see more sophisticated groups of adversaries that are looking to bypass next-generation technologies like FireEye, for example. We've seen a large amount of, probably a majority of cases where there's been a majority of large data breach cases, that is, where there's been detection but no human response until, as Tim mentioned, the impacted organization gets a call from the FBI or some other third party that's been able to monitor command and control or some other backscatter from the attack. And finally, we also see quite a few cases, which I think is probably the second most common, where there is detection, but there is a lack of a human reaction, human response, but that response is defective in some way, and we're going to see some case studies of that. So let's talk about where we're winning. I heard a great phrase the other day that I thought I'd steal: expense in depth. We're very good at spending money right now as an industry. A lot of people go to RSA every year and spend millions of dollars on the next gen security appliance, endpoint security software that makes all kinds of claims about protecting against 0 days and APT and a bunch of other alphabet soup. And I've got here so much next-genification. You heard it here first. So, we're really good at spending money on the problem, but we're less good about developing process around those technologies. And we've seen many clients who have installed technologies like FireEye, NetWitness, and so forth, and they're just not being effective, or they're not effective investments, rather, because of a lack of smooth integration into their operating environment. We are good at forensics. We're getting really good at performing autopsies on our networks, but of course that doesn't actually stop the breach. It's great for figuring out what happened and perhaps figuring out how we can prevent the same thing happening in the future. But if you're doing forensics, you've already lost. Where we're failing. So timely detection of intrusions, as I mentioned. There may be as Tim also referred to earlier, there may be a detection event, but there just isn't a timely and effective human response to that intrusion detection event. Let's set the stage a little bit here. The current slide is intended to demonstrate to you how the cyber underground effectively has become professionalized in the last decade. Those of you that were around at the turn of the century will remember viruses like I Love You, the event where the EP-3 spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea, resulted in a big hacker conflict. We then saw the Code Red virus that kind of grew out of that, SQL Slammer. And then as you can see, as we move along to events like Operation Aurora, Stuxnet, Comment Crew, Dooku, Shady Rat, Flame, and so forth, we see a lot more attacks which are the results of professional groups, whether they be organized crime, state-sponsored or otherwise. And our philosophy for defending has not changed, and at the pace that it really needs to in order to keep up with this significant investment by the adversary on developing offensive technologies. So with that investment, we've seen significant change in tactics by the adversary. We've changed the way that we build our networks. We've, in some cases, focused on certain types of defense, like perimeter firewalls and so forth. And so we've seen the adversary change their tactics as well over the last decade. Microsoft has very successfully spent a lot of money on securing its network services, although you wouldn't think it if, from the S-channel bug the other week. Implementation of security technology to prevent exploitation or reduce the risk of exploitation, rather, like DEP and ASLR. And so all of these things have contributed towards the TTPs that we see from adversaries today that we have to deal with, that we have to understand in order to create an effective response to an intrusion attempt. And just to clarify, these are professionals that we're talking about at the moment. Clearly, it's easier to detect and respond to more, if you will, script kiddie attacks, automated tools like Nessus. Professional attackers do not use Nessus and Qualys. That's why I always laugh at pen test companies that just go and run Qualys on Nessus. I ask them, hey, which nation state is Nessus exactly? And of course, they don't really have a response to that. So we're talking about professional attackers here that use very asymmetric methodologies, multidisciplinary approach in order to achieve their end goal. So what are some of the success factors of the adversary today in terms of getting into organizations? One of the ironies here, I think, is that while we're spending a lot of money on technologies like FireEye and NetWitness, we're failing to spend sufficiently on the basics, like poor network segmentation, excessive account privileges. In fact, if you're interested in this, I wrote a pretty detailed blog post on dark reading about a year ago on entitled Back to Basics. But these are the things that are really causing the adversary to succeed, and they're really not that sophisticated. So it's very important, well, hopefully for organizations to think about the basics before they start deploying sophisticated defenses, but at the very least should be thinking about these things in parallel. And of course, at the end here, we have slow response times as being an extremely compounding factor on our ability to defend against sophisticated adversaries. So just to kind of frame that up in terms of, well, what is an effective response? What kind of time frame do we need to respond within in order to make this, in order to really give ourselves the best possible shot at getting the adversary out of the network in a time-efficient manner? First 24 hours of initial access to the environment is clearly critical. Both the attacker and the defender, we're playing at FusionX, we're playing offense mostly, simulating these attacks. And I can tell you the first thing you want to do when you get onto that network is move laterally. You don't want to risk that machine getting unplugged, or the person going home for the day, or even seeing something suspicious and having the IT support folks reimage their machine. So rapid lateral movement is key for the success of the adversary and key for defenders in terms of preventing that. After 24 hours, you can expect the adversary to have established multiple command and control methods. They probably have something like Ghost or PlugX as a primary method of C2, but they'll likely have multiple backup methodologies as well. including things like web shells and VPN access into your environment. The Chinese in particular love to get access to VPN accounts with high levels of privilege, so they can use that as an additional route into your network. 1 week out, we're talking about an enterprise-wide compromise. In all likelihood, after a week of not responding effectively, not detecting, chances are the adversary has access to domain controllers, authentication servers like RSA appliances potentially, and all sorts of stuff. So at this point, and anything beyond this, it becomes significantly harder and more costly to remove the adversary from the environment. And in terms of how the adversary operates in order to achieve this, we demonstrate this here using effectively an OODA loop. OODA being an acronym for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. In other words, the adversary is discovering the environment. They're analyzing the assets in order to establish value associated with them. They're then surgically compromising assets that are useful to them, that may pull them closer to the end objective. Once they've compromised those, they'll mine those assets and then engage in this iterative process in order to help them move laterally and burrow themselves deeper and closer to their ultimate end goal. So now we're going to have a look at several case studies and examples of missed opportunities associated with common attacks. Now, of course, there's a very long list of reasons why attacks are successful and why responses are not successful. However, these are the most common that we see from our point, engaging in these simulated attacks and observing what the customer does wrong most of the time. So early activities, things like registration of phishing domains. If you can have a company, third-party company, and there's a few of them out there, one of them is Monitor, look for the name of your organization in new domain registrations, and actually you can get you can subscribe to the list of newly registered domains yourself if you want to just pull this directly into your SEM tool. But if you can detect the registration of that domain, you may have been able to identify a successful attack weeks before the spear fishes even start getting sent, or the phishing site potentially gets stood up. The standing up of phishing websites, and there are companies out there that will help monitor the internet for the presence of phishing websites containing your company's branding, logos, and what have you. One of those companies is RiskIQ. There are others of them out there as well. Transmission, of course, of the email spears. If you can set up your mail servers to identify those spear fishes as they come in order to respond more quickly, and of course this is where technologies like FireEye are focused, then that is going to give you the drop, hopefully, on quickly identifying if and who was exploited by the spearfish. External network reconnaissance. We don't see a lot of this these days, but we definitely still do see adversaries looking at external network services, especially when it comes to web applications. And, for example, we see a lot of SSH brute forcing still from China. Social network solicitation of employees. A lot of adversary groups love to use social networks in order to identify targets. So if you've had an employee that's in a highly sensitive position and they're being solicited over a social network, and they are well educated and trained in what they should do in that instance, they could report that to you and help identify the presence of the early stages of an attack potentially. Use of social media, dark web for attack planning. Attackers just like you and I use chat and IRC and all kinds of messaging protocols. And there are companies out there that can provide you intelligence that can help monitor for some of these communications methods and potentially your company name being brought up in terms of planning an attack in the future potentially. And the creation of command and control infrastructure, you can also sometimes monitor It might use a domain name that has your company name in it, so it looks like a legitimate website, for example. Okay, so that was early opportunities. Now let's talk about days 1 through to 7. Well, we've obviously got patient 0, the first person on your network who's been successfully exploited. There's going to be lots of evidence on their machine in terms of how the attackers got in, the email address that the spearfish came from, and other artifacts that you can potentially use to create rules within products like FireEye to prevent other people being impacted, potentially block the email completely, identify if you can do rapid analysis and characterization of the malware, identify things like command and control channels so you can close those off from your network, and obviously identify what they did to that individual's machine, such as OS file system modifications and so forth. Early stage lateral movement, so this is at the point where they're moving from patient 0's machine potentially to the next hop on the network. There are various things that we can identify, such as the use of service accounts. Attackers will use tools like Mimikatz in order to dump passwords out of memory on patient 0's machine, which they will then use to move laterally on the network through protocols like RDP, SMB, and so forth. There's also security products out there that can look for user behaviors, and so all of a sudden if someone in the accounting or maybe in the development group is connecting to a machine in the accounting or finance group, that might be an uncharacteristic behavior that you can key off of and detect the attack early. And of course, the attacker in all likelihood will then be engaging in early reconnaissance on the network in order to also facilitate that network, that lateral network movement. Again, the attackers probably don't know a lot about your internal environment at this point, so they're going to be looking to get into internal systems, information repositories that can tell them things about your internal environment, network diagrams, asset inventories, and so forth. Some of the things that inhibit an effective response, we're going to actually look at 4 different examples of this now. So I'll just skip to the next slide and we'll jump straight into that. So response effectiveness. Okay, some of the common issues that we see here include failing to understand the implications of an alert. So you see an alert from FireEye or an IDS or wherever it's coming from, and the person looking at that alert doesn't necessarily understand the nature of the asset that's been compromised. A lot of organizations still do a really bad job of asset management. They may not have necessarily associated a risk rating with assets. So the laptop of the CEO and the laptop of an assistant with not much access is seen from a SOC standpoint potentially as equals, where clearly they should be seen. The CEO's laptop obviously is going to have more sensitive information on it and should be prioritized. And so we often see this and this impacting significantly in the effectiveness of the response. And we also see inappropriate responses to alerts. So the SOC or maybe the IT team even not escalating the alert effectively and doing something that may even hamper an investigation in the future. So we have an example scenario here. Network IDS detects beaconing from command and control on the desktop node. Desktop support team is notified, who then re-image the infected system. And of course, the act of re-imaging the infected system destroys a lot of the evidence that we just mentioned on the previous slide, which we could have used otherwise to affect a good response. So as far as we know, there could be other machines on the network that have been infected. However, the only system that this particular customer could have used to find out more about the attack is now being re-imaged, and that evidence has been trampled all over. So key issues with this particular scenario: assignment of untrained IT staff to handle the breach. So it was regular IT people with very basic skills, not much knowledge of security that were charged with handling, managing the alerts. Remediation method, as we mentioned, resulted in destruction of otherwise forensically helpful data. And in this particular case, and this is a real-world example, a lack of complete investigation, so they re-imaged the machine essentially and thought, well, that's that, we're okay. And that resulted in the adversary remaining on the network through other infection points. And 3 months later, they realized that the whole network had been breached. So scenario one, some take-homes, cross-training of IT staff. Even if your IT staff are not necessarily going to be your investigators, they do need to be trained on basics such as preservation of evidence, imaging of drives, maintenance of custody. Not so important necessarily for dealing with state-sponsored attacks, but they do need to be familiar with that for things like employee termination, imaging activities, and so forth. And understanding when they've hit the limit of their skills and they need to escalate these events back to the SOC or whoever's responsible for performing real forensics. And there needs to be oversight from the SOC or some security function of how IT is involved in these type of activities as well. Okay, security technology integration. This is a big one. Oh, by the way, and just saw a question pop up that I'll answer in real time. C2 stands for command and control, and we've got that term here again with actually articulated in a different way, CNC. So you'll hear that quite a lot. So in terms of security technology integration, there are some common issues here that we see all over the place. This is assuming the technology even gets plugged in, and we've seen many cases where great technologies have been purchased and they're just sitting somewhere gathering dust or just not integrated well into the network. So many organizations just plug things in and hope that they'll work. There's often improper integration with things like SIM/SEM tools, internal processes. And there's a case study here where so-called next-gen content gateway detects HTTP-based command and control. Alert gets generated, however, the alert was not sufficiently escalated and did not ever result in a human response. And it's my understanding that this is what happened, based on public information, this is what happened with the target breach, that FireEye did say that it did actually cause an alert, however, it never resulted in a human response to that alert. So some of the issues here, content gateway alerting wasn't being correctly aggregated and prioritized within the SIM/SEM tool. If you've got a next generation product that may be very good, those alerts shouldn't necessarily be prioritized on a one-to-one scale as an older technology like a firewall drop rule or something. So it's important that these technologies are correctly prioritized and integrated into SIM/SEM environments. That's the next point. So value of data from new technologies lost in the noise, and the business context of the targeted system wasn't correctly understood either, which should have been resulted in further prioritization by the SEM tool if risk information associated with asset management was also being integrated. So scenario 2 take-homes. First one here, consider possibility of higher value weighing of data from more capable technologies, like FireEye, for example. Ensure any new technology is integrated into centralized logging, and integrate asset management data, which includes, hopefully, risk information in order to identify and understand the implication of attacks. Data classification and asset management. Some of the common issues we see here are no or poor data classification in the environment, data not being tagged correctly, cross-pollination of highly sensitive data and low-sensitive data being stored on the same file servers. And these are all things that compound organizations' ability to effectively respond to these attacks. And maybe not understanding where the data is. We've seen organizations that simply have no idea where on the network their PII is. They might be doing a very good job of something like PCI, but PCI type data isn't all we have to be worried about. Clearly, the public doesn't care whether the data on you that was stolen was regulated or not when there's a big data breach in terms of reputational damage. And so it's very important to understand where all of that data is whether it's regulated or not, because it could result in significant damage to your reputation if breached. So third scenario here, technology company is breached, does not respond appropriately, and just because of a poor understanding of assets impacted. And the key issues here, data classification model didn't allow for a more risk-based approach to where that information is stored or managed. And subsequently, the high-value data is stolen because a file server is breached and it's not recognized that that server contains sensitive information because of a failure to correctly classify. And if you're in a big organization, large FI, for example, chances are you're getting attacked every day. So it's not just alerts you need to prioritize, it's investigations. Which investigation needs more priority than the rest? And understanding implications of an attack, such as a file server with sensitive data existing on it, is definitely a key variable there. So scenario 3 take-homes, need to create mature classification models based on what could really harm your business. Deploy tools and processes to find and document where that data is located. There are some great tools out there for data mining file servers. One of the newer tools I've seen is Nuix, which I've been pretty impressed with for doing that. And then integrate this information back into asset management databases, which is the previous topic which we discussed. And final example here, coordinated responders. So a lot of the common issues we see are no off-the-shelf response plans. So the organization should think about different scenarios under which you may be, conditions under which you may be attacked. Why might people come after you? Engage in threat modeling, figure out what could damage your business. I like to tell customers, what's your billion-dollar issue, right? What could threaten the stability of your organization? What could cause the CEO of your company to be fired by the board if this were to happen? And then build off-the-shelf response plans based around that. So once you do detect an incident, you're able to quickly execute on that plan in order to minimize the impact. So scenario 4 here is organization detects breach, however dysfunctional cross-organization coordination results in insufficient response to breach, and all their information gets stolen. What are the issues here? There's lots of issues with this, but some of the top-of-mind problems are no clearly defined roles and responsibilities. No one knows who's doing what. When it comes to something like a remediation event, there are insufficient resources to support that. Asset owners and IT are not trained in incident response protocols. There's only the security team that know what they're doing, and obviously you need the help of everyone rather, in a significant breach like that. No protocols for communication security. A lot of these active threat groups, including the Chinese, will aggressively go after your email servers because they want to be able to read what you know about them. They want to go into platforms like Jira in order to look at tickets and figure out exactly what's going on, what remediation might be planned, so they can work around that and get the drop on you. So there's no communications protocols. We recommend to our clients at the very least they use S-MIME. Ideally should have a stack of separate laptops that are completely separate from their domain, have air cards in them, hardened configurations, email domain outside of the organization so that kind of a tiger team of responders can communicate securely in the event of a significant data breach. And we may very well be prepared from a security operations standpoint, but it's very important that other organizations like marketing, legal, PR are also involved in the planning process and are trained in responding to breaches. And the final bullet here is related to that: no prior retention of external legal counsel. If you're breached, and this is all part of an effective response, right, you're going to want to have external legal counsel already retained so that you can bring in an organization like ours through legal counsel so that the investigation is not discoverable if it ever went to court. And so having external legal counsel who is familiar with data breach investigation on retainer is very important if you're a large organization. So finally, some take-homes here. Very important to develop realistic breach scenarios in order to, and you should red team those scenarios as well, by the way, either through an internal red team or an external company like FusionX. in order to test how effective, it's great to have things on paper, and people do paper-based IR exercises, but it's important that you actually test those in a real attack scenario as well. Develop and document the processes and make sure everyone's trained in that. PR, all your PR people, marketing people, for example, should have off-the-shelf boilerplate press releases that they can use under different scenarios in order to mitigate reputational damage, for example, and deploy technologies to support communication security in the event of a response. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Tim. But before I do that, this was a pretty relatively short conversation on an extremely complex topic. So please, if there's something that matters to you that we didn't touch on, please submit in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get enough time to answer all your questions at the end.
Yeah, Tom, that was a great summary. I'm impressed that you were able to get that much into that amount of time. But there's a lot to it. And I know I have some questions of my own. So please, among the audience, if you have questions, please, you can submit your question anytime. You don't have to wait for the end. Just hit the Ask a Question button and click Submit, and we'll start queuing those up after we hear from Eric. Eric, I'm hoping that you can give us some sense for, Tom gave us a really good high-level view of what some of the issues are, the pitfalls, and what you can do about it. I'm hoping you'll be able to drill deeper into that. So let me hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. So a little bit of information about ThreatTrack security. We've been around through acquisition and some name changes in various names over the past 20 years or so. One of the key things about us is we have been analyzing malware. If anybody does that sort of work, we were the creators of the original CW Sandbox, a dynamic malware analysis tool. And we have a lot of endpoints under management, about 10 million, that constantly send us malware. And as a result of that and the sort of emergence of big data and combining that with our malware analysis capabilities, that heritage has really brought us some really interesting information and kind of changed the way we started to look at threats, because I think we looked at threats and attacks the way everyone else did, which is, I have an event, I need to go address it, okay, I'm done, let's go to the next one. And I think that's really been a disservice to the community, the world as a whole. And so I want to talk about some ways to kind of change the way you look at threats in a more holistic way. Oh, this is a build slide. There we go. So we're going to talk about best practices for speeding detection. To find it faster, you find it faster when you know what you're looking for, okay? So the first thing is don't ignore the data. When we start talking about or talk to people that have had a breach, it's pretty clear that what happens is they get alerted, as Tom pointed out, very often by a third party, and something happens. And so now they go try to figure out where it is and how it got in. But the fact is that you probably already had some alert or some warning that this happened. So we think that you need to take the data, you need to use it proactively. So that means collect it. That means you're going to be pulling data from different sources. As Tom said, textual integration and having things pulled into a SIM or some sort of analytics tool is important. The other thing you need to do is analyze it, and you need to analyze even blocked attempts to get in. Because when we start talking about campaigns, I'll get into that in a little bit, it's not the final event that was the breach, it's the leading up to it that is the thing that tells you that something is going on. You need to correlate it. So you don't just look at, hey, this is an alert and it came from this place or this person. You need to say, these people or these groups of people were targeted over this period of time by these people or using these vectors. And that correlation is what gives you an idea that, this is something that you need to understand. And that's correlate over time. So it's very important to start thinking about the fact that these attacks, persistent attackers in particular, tend to work over a longer period of time, especially if the asset has a lot of value to them. So I think, like I said, attacks are not point-in-time events, and focusing on these individual alerts or trying to figure out which ones are important, it results in what I call alert fatigue. I don't think there's been a major breach reported in the last year or 2 or maybe 3 where there wasn't some sort of alert that something was going on. And so the question, Tom talked a little bit about why people missed it. I think the problem is that we're looking for, that individual magic, light that's going to go off that tells us that something is amiss. I think the other thing is that while it's important to prioritize on, as Tom said, next generation systems and the alerts they provide because they tend to be very valuable, you can't look at those only, because then what you have is a really big list of high visibility alerts from your next gen product, and you might be missing some other information. You don't really see patterns there. So, maybe instead of a set of dots that all look the same, what you really want to do is pull more information together. So you need to leverage all the data, blocked event data, user data, other system data, data classification information, and pulling that all together is going to help you figure out how to prioritize your responses, right? Because again, it's not that people didn't know, it's that they didn't know which ones that they should be looking for. And so now when you take this data and you look at it in this correlated manner, what you can identify are some patterns. So here maybe I have an attack campaign over time against a target or a couple of targets using different methods, right? And what you're trying to do is pull this information together. So having multiple size dots, if you will, and different types of data allows you to see things in a different way, as opposed to, I had an alert, what do I do about it? It's, hey, I had an alert about this last week for the same person with it was a malicious PDF, right? So that's important to understand when you look at when you're trying to figure out, what the attack pattern is when you're looking to identify an attack, obviously before the breach occurs, but you can't always do that. Now, we're asking you to collect a lot of data and do a lot of analysis, and it's a lot of heavy lifting, and you got technical integration, and I think the fear for most people is, well, we've put all this stuff in. I love expense and depth. I'm going to be using that. I think it's perfect. I think people spend a ton of money and aren't getting the value that they want, and I'm telling you now that you need to put more effort into using that information, and I think people say, well, how am I going to see the forest through the trees, right? So, as a best practice, I think what's really important is when you start looking at this data, now you're looking for anomalies. You're being attacked constantly. I think, everybody's under some form of attack, maybe not as serious as a super targeted attack, but there's some sort of attack going on against your enterprise all the time. So it's really important to first understand what normal looks like. And so here I have from an analytics engine that we've built that shows I've done a certain amount of email processing per day, and basically I'm finding a similar amount of threat data in that email, whether it's malicious links or attachments or whatever. And that's sort of what my world looks like. So it's boring because it's the same, but it's a little bit scary, right? And so I think, what's important is that you understand what normal looks like, because if you understand what normal looks like, right, now when you see something change like this is not normal, right? It's very interesting, but it's not normal. So now I can say, hey, I have an event that may be occurring over time, and so I'm looking at maybe a week's amount of processing here, and I can say, in the middle of the week I had a huge spike in threats that were detected and blocked, and that does not match my email flow. So maybe I'm under some sort of attack. The second thing I get from it right off the bat is, well, now when my email flow went up, my actual threat volume went down. So does that tell me that I've been breached already? They stop kicking on the front door when somebody's gotten in through the window. So it's important that you understand the normal and then deviations from normal and what those deviations mean. But I think if you take a more holistic view of the data, a higher level view, you can get some of this information, this recognition easier and faster, and that means you can respond faster. So, that little blip there, I might be able to pick off the fact that I've been breached and I'm still maybe in the first 24 hours, right? That's important. So Tom talked about, understanding data, where your data is, data classification, and I agree with him on that. I think that's super important. You have to understand what the adversary could be after. You have to understand whether that stuff, whether it's movie files or customer databases or whatever, if it's leaving the infrastructure, you need to understand, hey, this server should never be talking out anywhere or talking to any other server. There's things you need to understand. That is important. It's very hard to do, though. And I would suggest that for folks that are trying to take a first stab at this is that you start thinking about, when you think about data and systems, you should also consider the users. So it's simple to understand that, hey, if I'm in the finance group, that I have access to my finance information. If I'm in the guy in the group of the guy in the group that does the creating of digital content and puts it out before we send it out to our distributors, then I have access to sensitive information. And so now, if you understand the context of the user, it almost doesn't matter as much where their data is. You know that they have access to sensitive data, and you could escalate response to attacks on high-value targets, not just the data, but the user. Right? So that's another way to help you get to understand faster that you need to respond to an attack on this particular user because they have access to high-value assets, even if you don't know exactly where all those assets are. So I was glad Tom touched on re-imaging. This is a big issue for us. I think I'll offer some real-world examples here, but you miss a lot when you just sort of have this knee-jerk re-imaging response. And I did a speaking engagement a few weeks ago at a financial services event, and they said, we just re-image immediately. And I said, why? And they said, well, then we know it's clean. So here's a shirt, and I spilled coffee on it, and I could just toss it out, right? Because I don't want to clean it. It's stained. I can just toss it out. But if I know something about the stain and I know I can clean it fairly easily, then maybe there's some value there. And so malware is the same thing. If I want to do some analysis of this shirt, then maybe that would be useful. And by re-imaging, you're actually losing information that's super valuable. So when I see something that's not normal, somebody's machine is beaconing or whatever, or I see even an attack that was blocked, AV popped up on somebody's machine and blocked it, I want to get that sample and I want to analyze it. So the reason you do that is you may find a useful footprint in something you've already caught and blocked, or obviously if you found something that's infected and you want to know what it's doing. So here's one where I had a box that was infected and it created a listener on port 123, which a lot of folks might recognize as network time protocol, right? Unfortunately, this box didn't have any NTP client or server on it, so it was being used for other means. The other one is MS Paint was launched, and it was used, it exploited and used to go out and pull down a payload and do some other things. Well, that's because this box had application whitelisting on it, and so MS Paint was trusted. But if I see other people's MS Paint calling out to the internet, maybe now I know that I need to start looking at those machines. If I had just re-imaged this and not looked at the box, not done a forensic capture and analyzed the malware, I wouldn't know that. So you need to start thinking about the use of automated analysis tools. So you're not doing this manually, so you have this sort of force multiplier for your SOC and CERT teams. Again, re-imaging is not necessarily equal to high security. You get a lot of other threat intelligence like hosts that are called out to, so we'll see individual IP addresses, but maybe even more valuable is domains. So Tom talked about domain registration, phishing domain registration, but there's also a lot of reuse out there. Things that I haven't seen pop up for 4 or 5 or 6 years are now being reused, and so the domain registration happened a long time ago. It's considered trustworthy, even though it's on someone's blacklist somewhere. So it's important to be able to look this stuff up, and there are services you can use to see if these things are known malicious. This one happens to be tied to a particular malicious exploit. But again, if you just re-image the box and clean it, you don't get the access to that information. So you need to always assume you're under attack. I'm sorry, but that's a fact. I think one of the challenges is that, we think that the attack only occurs when they succeed, and that's not the case. The attack is occurring before it succeeds, and if you can pick that off and analyze it, very often that's going to help you get to a point where you can respond really quickly. So I think, that's one of the things that, the attacks don't have to be successful for them to be valuable for you to respond to the one that is successful, and I think that's maybe where people are missing the boat a little bit. So just to wrap up, how to speed response. Well, the first thing is you got to collect threat data. That means, do the analysis, but the threat data, that intelligence helps identify threats earlier once they succeed and correlate them across, find them across the enterprise. The next thing is use automated analysis tools or services. Helps you gather intelligence faster. This is all about speed. Next, correlate it over time. That helps you see patterns faster, right? Hey, this user's had 20 bad PDFs in the last week. And then you need to understand normal, because when you know normal, you can see anomalies faster, right? And you'll understand what they mean. Then you want to define critical targets. That's systems, data classification, systems, and users. I think that will help you prioritize faster. Just because you haven't seen data from the finance server go out the window, if the CFO's machine is compromised or someone in their office is compromised, that means that you really want to take a serious look at that. And again, don't just knee-jerk clean and move on. That's not as helpful. And then the last thing is you have to have an escalation plan. You really need to be able to focus your best resources where they need to go. And if you have an escalation plan, you can do that faster. Hey, I know if these events occur with these people or groups of people, or if I see this type of pattern of attack, then I need to have this plan in place so I know what to do and who to send out there, right? So I know we were sort of running a little tight there, and I hope I haven't gone over too bad, and I think I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Thanks so much, Eric. Both great presentations, and I know there's a bunch of questions that we can follow up. I mean, this is a very in-depth question and very specific to the enterprise that you work in and the resources that you have available. So we're going to get to some questions in a second. Before we begin that, I want to ask you to please fill out the feedback form that's open in front of your computer. To complete the form, please press the Submit Answer button at the bottom of the page. Thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form. Your participation in the survey allows us to better serve you. We had one question from the audience that I think is very common that I hear about triggers, about what are some of the things that you can look for or that you may see in monitoring your environment that may suggest, okay, now it's time to do deeper forensics. And this particular questioner asks, especially if there's not a tool in play. Either one of you.
Tom, do you want to take that, or I'll take it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say that it depends on your organization, right? Again, I think this goes back to what Tom talked about with data classification and understanding if certain assets might be under attack. And what I was trying to highlight with the users, first you want to understand the target. I think that always gives you an idea that things need to be escalated. But I think the other thing is that I question, why is the tool not in play? I think there are tools that are free out there. You can submit things on the internet to different sites to get some analysis done. I think more of that needs to happen, and I think people need to. I'm a big believer in people bringing certain things in house if they need to. The tools aren't super expensive, and what you'll find is if you spend the time and energy to get them set up and established, what you can do is more analysis, and that's really something that's super valuable.
Yeah, definitely.
As a single trigger.
Yeah, I would also add to that when it comes to deciding if you're going to perform deeper forensics or not, there's not necessarily a single trigger that will help you make that decision. But even if you don't think there's justification yet on using your own team or bringing in an external firm to perform in-depth forensics, it's okay to re-image systems. Just make sure you preserve the evidence first, right? So obviously imaging and forensics are two different steps. And so what I would just add to that is, regardless of whether you're going to perform deeper forensics or not, it's always good to take an image of the machine. And if you don't know how to do that and you want to wait to see if something else happens, maybe just turn the machine off and provision the user a different system.
It's a great point.
Just to remind the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please type your question in the text box located below the media player and click the Submit Question button. We had another question related to social engineering. The audience member asks, can you speak to the latest social engineering threats and your recommendations for educating staff and defending against social engineering attacks? I think in context of what we're talking about here, a lot of deeper attacks begin with some sort of social engineing, phishing, or that sort of thing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about
right.
getting from there to doing something about it.
Yeah. So this is kind of a related topic to some of the things we talked about earlier. Actually, the first thing you need to understand, well, two things you need to understand is, number one, you can't rely wholly on your users to be educated, and number two, you can't rely 100% on our technology to work. And so it's, you kind of need a perfect harmony of both. This is a position that is I've mentioned on dark reading webinars before, and there's a lot of conversation in the security community about this, whether it's a waste of time to train employees and how effective that really is. And my position on it is really that you've got to do both. You've got to have good technology working well with well prepared and educated users. And if you send 100 sophisticated spearfish emails, you're going to get one user at least that clicks on the link. From the work we do, which often starts with some form of spearphishing attack, which is kind of social engineering people to click a link, we get about a 20% click rate, and that's about as good as it's going to get. That's in an organization that does a lot of training. It's 40% and above for organizations that don't do that training. And so for that 20% users that are going to click the link, that's where your technology controls step in. And we mentioned a few of those earlier, like identifying domains that have been registered that contain your corporate branding, because if you already know about one of those domains, when the user clicks that link, hopefully they'll never get through to the website because you've blocked it at the perimeter. So it works, but you need to both rely on technology and user training, I think, for an effective defense.
Okay. I'm going to ask another question that we hear a lot at Dark Reading. One of our audience asks, would you agree that there should be a shift from prevention to more detection and response training for organizations? I think you both addressed, the inevitability that you're going to be compromised. So can you say anything about what's your sense about what the balance should be between those two things?
I would say, as one of my old bosses used to say when somebody would, talk about a solution they were deploying or whatever, he would say, well, how's that working for you? So, detection isn't working as well as people think it is, and we're still getting breached. So I think there has to be a shift to, from prevention to response and analysis. I don't know if it's detection and prevention are almost the same thing. If you detect it, then, you've sort of prevented it. But I would say if you need to work on response, because that's clearly where we're failing,
Tim, in terms of that distinction between detection and prevention, are you kind of speaking to proactive versus reactive?
Yeah, I think the audience member is asking, as a concept, historically we've looked at the environment as a perimeter, and we focus more on prevention of attack. And now we see a lot more emphasis on forensics and sort of post-compromise analysis. Is that a fair direction to be going in, or should we be, and what's the right balance there?
Yeah, I would say that we do forensics pretty, and I think I mentioned this earlier, I think we do a pretty good job of forensics today. Especially if you don't mind paying a lot of the folks in the forensic space now, charging $600 an hour. So it's pretty expensive, but we can do it pretty well. I think what we don't do so well is the prevention side of things, right? Again, back to basics. When I talk about prevention, I'm not necessarily talking about sophisticated methodologies and new technologies. I'm talking about good asset management, risk management, and things like patch management that we're still not doing a great job of, that are all a key part of that prevention objective.
Okay. All right. Good. I had a follow-up from the member who asked earlier about triggers, and the question is, what are the triggers for zero-day vulnerabilities or unknown malware signatures? I guess these days we have a lot of tools that sort of work off of blacklist or whitelist types of
right.
technologies. But what if it's something that's not recognized?
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of behavioral tools out there that look for exploit-like behaviors and things doing certain things in to the host, certain writes, reads from memory, and that sort of thing. But the truth of the matter is that sophisticated attackers, they have all of these products in a lab somewhere. They've got FireEye, they've got NetWitness. They create, the analogy I use is it's kind of like the Bin Laden compound raid. They've got, the Marines, trained on that for weeks and weeks on a mock-up of Bin Laden's compound. In the cyber domain, attackers are doing exactly the same thing. They're making a mock-up of your environment. They've got the technologies they use. They already know that it's going to bypass those types of technologies, whether it's signature-based or behavioral. That said, obviously we want to make a best effort here, and clearly moving away from signatures and going for more of a behavioral approach is still the right direction to go in.
Okay. I think we might have time for just one more. Here's a question that I think is important for a lot of organizations that may be on the phone right now. What if I don't have a big staff? If I don't have malware analysts and forensic analysts on staff, can you give us some sense for what types of approaches or tools might be useful if you're a smaller organization that maybe doesn't have a lot of people to throw at this problem?
Yeah, I think that that there are certainly a lot of tools out there that you can use for doing quick and dirty sandboxing of malware, for example, to see what it does. I think the key is, though, please don't outsource everything. We deal with at FusionX. We have a number of clients who are family offices of very high net worth individuals, $1 billion, for example, and they typically don't have a lot of technology staff in their offices. Maybe 8, 10 investors and maybe one IT guy, and that's a good example of that. And what we say is, make sure, don't rely on a third party completely for monitoring of your environment. You still need to be familiar with what technologies you have installed, what's going on, but then almost view it as a kind of an escalation. So then leverage third party services for more sophisticated processes like malware analysis when it's required. But it's very important. We see companies that completely outsource everything and totally lose touch with what's going on in their network, and it's important that you don't do that.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think there are certain tools now that have come to the market that make it a little easier for smaller organizations to beef up their ability to not only prevent but also to do some analysis and do some cleanup. So I think that there's a market for that now, because it's realized that there are a lot of organizations with small IT staffs or no IT staff that need this protection. If they have outsourced everything, it's possible that they have some sort of a managed service provider that's doing a lot of things for them, and they can really talk to them about breaches and response to breaches and detection of things and analysis of threats. And how they're doing that, and I think it's up to them to push their providers to make sure that they're giving them what they need there, and they need to do it now, right, as opposed to after the fact, wish that they had done it. I think that's key.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. I'm afraid we're out of time, but we definitely appreciate the time that you guys have given to us, and hopefully our audience got a lot out of it. I know I did. For more information on today's webinar, please visit any of the resource links open before you. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Additionally, you can view today's event on demand by visiting http://www.darkreading.com/events. Thank you for attending today's webinar, How to Speed Up Detection of Advanced Attacks, brought to you by ThreatTrack and Dark Reading. This webinar is copyright 2014 by United Business Media Limited. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that's the case, by ThreatTrack and Dark Reading, who are solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, Tom Parker and Eric Hay, I'm Tim Wilson. Thanks for your time and have a great day.